thanks everybody for coming today. I'm part of a team that is looking at the interrelationship between biodiversity and bushfires in the Adelaide Mount Lofty Ranges region and the Eyre Peninsula. And this is one initial paper that we've done where we looked at the relationship between the cultures of forests and how we perceive of forests and the changing nature of how we respond to the bushfire risk. I'm within Adelaide University along with now Guy Robinson, who's the lead researcher in the project, and Annette Bardsley, who's one of the PhD students. Delene Weber's at the UniSA, and Emily Moskwa is the postdoctoral fellow, and you might have come across her in her travels. She's both at Adelaide University and UniSA. The work I'm presenting today comes from one particular paper where we worked strongly with JUNA and the AMLR and NRM boards and workers within those regions to look at the question of how bushfire risk is overlapping with conservation value, which is overlapping with urban development, really to try and get to the crux of the question of how these tensions are working within this particular region of the Adelaide Mount Lofty Ranges. And there you can see the map there, which details some of those, which emerged from a series of workshops. Basically, our concept of research is that if you work closely with people that are working on the ground, we'll get some very good and strong messages from them about future risk, future opportunity, and we don't talk to those people enough. And so it's very much in the ethos of this conference that the relationship with people and developing those relationships are key. I've got this paper here, and if you're interested, I can give you a copy. This work we're doing, and like most presenters have already talked about, is coming out from a concept that climate change within these spaces is going to drive risk very substantially. And some earlier work about a decade ago now that I was involved in looked at what are the key climate change vulnerabilities within the Adelaide Mount Lofty Ranges. Right, number one was the bushfire risk, because the risks are multiple. We're seeing a warming, drying trend. We're seeing strong influences of high pressure systems at mid-latitudes that are generating long periods of heat, low humidity, followed by these significant changes across the landscape. If you just look at the last 4 spring rainfall deciles for South Australia from 2012 to 2015, arguably climate change is coming through, even in our little regional patch, at a rate and at an extent which exceeds some of those projections. And so climate change and that single driver of bushfire risk is likely to become more significant. So there's a context of climate change is increasing bushfire-related risks. There's also a context of a change in vegetation management history, and we wanted to explore that a little bit, that actually these forests have never been at equilibrium, and we treat them almost as though they were, and I'll talk to that in a second. The urban development and planning history has changed, and at different times we've used this landscape in fundamental different ways, and that reflects, if you like, a culture of how we value that landscape, and that's a very important part of that. And there's another context that more people are moving into these fire-prone peri-urban fringes, so more people are exposing themselves to this risk. Together, that suggests an increased vulnerability, potentially a culture of risk. Historically, these landscapes have always burned. Paleoecological studies support this. Recent early settler reports suggest that the forests of Mount Lofty Ranges were not as extensive as we see now when we look out the window. There's increasing evidence from a range of sources in that way. That was probably and largely through Indigenous fire stick farming or the management of the landscape to provide forage and to mitigate fire risk. So arguably what we're looking at now and treating in relation to management of fire is not what the first settlers found when they settled these landscapes. That raises interesting questions. Then we had a very strong colonial influence over the forests. Much of the forest was logged at least once. Almost nothing wasn't logged at least once. Other areas were substantially cleared for agriculture. But what we've seen during the modern era, as those primary industries have become less important in the peri-urban space has been a return of the forest in both public and private lands, largely because we value those forests. We value them for their biodiversity. We particularly value them for their amenity. They're magnificent places to live, arguably some of the most attractive places to live on Earth. But that means now we're getting a return of the forest, a contiguous forest, which has no border between those key biodiversity assets on the ridge through to these heavily settled suburban spaces. That suggests we're in a new period of risk in relation to our settlement patterns. We've also done a large-scale survey which received 988 responses from Lower Eyre Peninsula and from this region, Adelaide Mount Lofty Ranges, asking people the types of questions like, what attracts you to this forested peri-urban fringe? Almost everybody said things like relaxed lifestyle, escape from urban life, leafy neighbourhood. These are beautiful places. The forces or the culture of attraction is very strong in these places. Many of you may live or you certainly recreate in those spaces. They're attracting us to those spaces. But at the same time, areas like this are revegetating. And that means that this area used to be a dairy farm. It's revegetated over the last 30 or 40 years in which it's been settled, and now the canopy is more or less contiguous with the adjacent Blair National Park. There are many spaces like this now around the suburban area. They're no longer the places that people moved into. They've changed. In many ways, they've changed for the better. Vegetation has returned to these spaces, higher levels of biodiversity, more habitat, all great. It also means, though, there's significantly more fuel within these landscapes to provide and increase the vulnerability to the bushfire risk. This happens to be the street where I grew up, hence my interest. But there are also then forces of repulsion coming in. These cultures of attraction are starting to conflict with what we could consider as forces of repulsion, where those perceptions of vulnerability are going to change the way people think about the forested urban fringe. From this survey of 988 South Australians, we can see that the vulnerabilities are quite significant. In a Likert scale, from 1, no, I don't feel vulnerable in relation to the bushfire risk, in relation up to 7, most respondents were feeling vulnerable in some way. In our discussions with junior staff in workshops as well, there was always also a sense that when they talked to landholders, there was a new sense of vulnerability within these spaces, an emergence of a culture of risk, if you like. So we ran 5 workshops with groups of differing from 10 to 20 junior staff from September 2014 through to February 2015. In each workshop, we used local maps of vegetation to identify key assets, key biodiversity assets in particular, where they identified spaces in relation to development planning that were particularly problematic or particularly challenging, and where they saw wildfire risk. So this particular paper looks at it in a small-scale analysis on the map, but you can start to identify some particular targeted areas which were of concern. These overlapped areas in and around some of the more densely settled areas of the Mitcham Hills, for example, were identified by stakeholders as saying you're getting that overlap of high risk, high density, people moving into landscape, and that's where we're getting some follow-up PhD research currently. Also, you're getting overlaps, and most of this study was prior to the Samson Flat, but there's the Samson Flat fire, where you're getting spaces where there's developments moving in areas with high biodiversity value and also high bushfire risk. These suggest hotspots in the landscape that we could identify for planning, either to steer away from or provide particular targeted direction for development alternatives. These are some of the voices or some of the stories that were coming from different specialists from JUNA. In this work, we really emphasise those voices. In many cases, they're not heard. There may be reporting internally up through government and getting responses internally to government, but many people who are working and many people here know things You know things about risk, you know things about value that aren't necessarily being responded to. I think there's a bit of a gap there at times in the way that we manage some of these ideas. From one fire ecologist, the style of development of just scattered houses through high risk areas, it put individual dwellings at risk. New dwellings are often at the top of ridgeline, so you can capture the view, it's good, but you'll get them at the top of gullies where the fire is just going to come right up. And so it's not just the amount of development that's going on and continuing in the Mount Lofty Ranges, perhaps we can look at the forms of those developments in certain places. Several of the respondents talked about a shift in perception from this attraction to a repulsion that is happening. One senior ranger said, "Ever since the Victorian fires, even my parents and friends and houses around that area, they're so nervous now over summer with fire." Another responded, a district officer, "Since half of Canberra burnt and some houses in suburbia got burnt because of wildfire, it's like it can actually happen," and it did happen. That's when all councils started putting out these wildfire plans, and it was highlighted them right in front of them in black and white and coloured pictures and everything. That's my backyard. Trees started getting cut down and things started happening. So we're getting a shift. And is this shift fundamental enough to require some sort of transformation in the way we think about bushfire and bushfire management? We talk in this article about the tension between these cultural forces of attraction and repulsion. You get this dynamic relationship with urban development, policy and practice to mitigate bushfire risks, and policy and practice to conserve and promote native vegetation. Arguably, for a long time, we've been really good at controlling and mitigating bushfire risks, and the Sampson Flat story suggests we still are, that we're very good at actually reducing the vulnerability to this hazard. Nevertheless, as we get more urban development and we get urban development in potentially inappropriate places, that may shift, and that dynamic might shift fundamentally, and it may move away from things that we value like good bushfire risk management and native vegetation together to focus more on urban development opportunities for their own sake rather than how they fit within that particular landscape. It's that tension that we think needs to be further investigated, and we're using some of our data analysis to do more detailed studies. So in conclusion, there are some key gaps that we identified for our workshop, through our workshop process in planning for these cultures of risk and value that we might want to look at. For example, we identified that there's currently no requirement to inform new residents when they move into a bushfire risk area that the level of bushfire risk. That's a simple thing that could be done when they are purchasing a property, that they could be required to be informed on that issue. At a basic level, you're attracted to this place, you're understanding all of those attractions, but you might have absolutely no idea of the bushfire risk in that same space. Currently, legislation does not require residential and transport infrastructure, new building, planning to account for wildfire risk beyond specific constraints to building practices. And you might have encountered these. If you move into a high bushfire risk area, you'll have constraints like requiring double glazing, etc. on your house. But the entire place, the entire suburban development may have been inappropriate in the first place. And those questions aren't being asked necessarily prior to that development. In particular, there is no requirement for junior staff who are specialists in this area of vegetation management to be consulted on new housing developments in relation to the implications for wildfire risk or conservation goals. So there's a gap there. If we're going to talk about this idea of learning and this interrelationship and getting around silos of relationships, then the development and DIPTI and the work associated with developments at local government need to interact at the same stage with those key players, like many of the people sitting in this room, who know a lot about these risks and values within the landscape. That narrative that is being generated by those people has to pass through and influence decision making. And at the moment, there's a bit of a gap. And we're starting to see some policy that's specifically directed to risks, such as increasing allowances for clearing of native vegetation around dwellings in those areas such as high and medium bushfire risk zones. And that is potentially leading to increases in native vegetation. At the moment, as the balance between repulsion and attraction is currently in the attraction's favour, perhaps that's not such an issue. If it shifts, people will be free to clear across the suburban areas of the Adelaide Mount Lofty Ranges without constraint. I'll leave it there. Thanks. for a question.